Did you know that Christy Mathewson played first base in the major leagues? I learned about this while doing research in John McGraw's autobiography. McGraw claims that he discovered that the great Mathewson was playing first base when he joined the New York Giants in mid-July 1902. Now, when you read what McGraw wrote here, you'll think that nobody knew that Mathewson was a great pitcher and that his predecessors in New York had foolishly squandered Mathewson's talents at first base. Yet McGraw's story is clearly embellished. It's based on reality, but it's been given a lot of dramatic effect to exaggerate the importance that he had on the team. I mean, he basically credits himself with teaching Christy Mathewson how to pitch, which isn't true. This really becomes obvious in this case when you go look at what actually happened. Mathewson was young, sure, but he was already an established pitching star by 1902. Mathewson won 20 games in 1901 with a 2.41 ERA. He pitched 36 complete games that year. Now, he did throw 23 wild pitches, which was worse in the entire National League, but that was probably due to his youth. After all, he was only 20 years old. As you'll recall, news of McGraw going to the Giants with half the Baltimore Orioles broke on July 17, 1902. Mathewson pitched that very day. This was his 19th appearance as a pitcher that season. Mathewson not only pitched, but he won. He won by a 6-3 score in front of 2,000 fans in Cincinnati. Well, so much for the claim of John McGraw joining the New York Giants only to find Christy Mathewson playing first base. However, it turns out that John McGraw wasn't entirely making things up. Mathewson did start 3 games at first base in 1902. He started there twice in late June and once in early July. He also played briefly in left field on July 14th, and then started at right field 3 times after McGraw joined the club. In other words, when McGraw tries to take credit for putting Dan McGann on first base instead of Mathewson, know that he's not entirely telling the truth. Now, the biggest question here is why in the world Mathewson played those games in the field. It only happened in 1902, by the way. And note, of course, that 3 of those starts in the field came after John McGraw came on as manager. Well, the truth is a little bit messy, but it is really interesting. The Giants started 1902 with veteran Jack Doyle at first base. Jack, known as Dirty Jack, and for good reason, was 32 years old at the time and had already played for 6 different major league clubs. This includes 2 separate stints with the New York Giants. Doyle's last start for the Giants at first base came on June 18, 1902. He was hitting a hair over 300 at the time and hit 3rd in the lineup. The last place Giants lost that game in Boston 9-4 in front of an estimated 500 fans. Now, Jack Doyle was inexplicably given his release after that game. Contemporary newspapers noted that Doyle, who had begun the season as captain, had been stripped of the captaincy a few days earlier. The Wikipedia article on Doyle claims that McGraw released him. That's impossible, of course, because John McGraw was still in Baltimore on June 18, 1902. This is yet another example of where we need to start using original newspaper coverage and retro sheet to clean up the history of the game. There are way too many of these simple mistakes floating around. And what's even more frustrating to me is that Doyle's Sabre biography doesn't even mention his 1902 season. The Buffalo Times noted that Doyle was a transient player, but didn't say anything about why he was dismissed. Meanwhile, the Rochester newspapers noted his good batting average and could only speculate on why he was released. The Washington Evening Star, which in those days was far superior to the now more famous Washington Post, wondered what club could stand a player like Doyle. 1 week later, the Washington newspapers reported that Jack Doyle was going to play for the Senators. Well, I guess it goes to show that you have to be careful who you criticize. However, with Doyle gone, the Giants had a huge problem. They needed a first baseman. Okay, this is where it gets confusing. Back on June 2nd, 1902, the Chicago Cubs released a weak-hitting 32-year-old rookie named Hal O'Hagan. His first name was reported as Harry in those days for reasons that I don't understand. The Giants signed O'Hagan right away, and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle predicted that he would likely replace Jack Doyle. This is while Doyle was still on the Giants. O'Hagan started 4 games in the outfield for the Giants in early June and was in the same lineup as Doyle for all 4 of those games. O'Hagan was then struck in the stomach by a line drive in the 5th inning of the June 6th game and wound up injured for a while. And then O'Hagan somehow shows up in Cleveland for 3 games in the American League, and I honestly can't figure out how he got there or why. O'Hagan started at first base for the Cleveland Indians in both games played on the June 17th doubleheader. As you can see here, his name was featured pretty prominently in the game write-up. O'Hagan started again on June 18th and apparently did quite well at first base. And then on June 20th, O'Hagan was with the New York Giants again, covering first base in the absence of Jack Doyle. You can see just how confusing this is by looking at the 1902 New York Giants defensive lineups on Baseball Reference. Doyle was clearly released to make way for O'Hagan, but the bizarre part is that O'Hagan wasn't with the Giants. I mean, I guess I could believe that the Giants wanted O'Hagan to get some more playing time and so they loaned him out to Cleveland, but it doesn't make sense because of the American League and National League War. Now, my instinct tells me that probably what happened is he was probably frustrated to have to play behind Jack Doyle and that he decided to go to the American League to sort of test the market and to see what would happen. Of course, Hal O'Hagan's only problem was that he couldn't hit a lick. Cleveland's The Plain Dealer noted on June 22nd that O'Hagan's biggest problem was his poor hitting. Never mind the fact, of course, that he hit .385 for those 3 games with the Indians. And now comes the fun part. On June 23rd, Brooklyn fans in the right field bleachers started chanting, "Hey O'Hagan," during the game. That should remind you of the old Darryl chant in the 1986 World Series. Well, that just goes to show you that there's nothing new under the sun. O'Hagan started at first base for about a week, and then they gave Mathewson a shot starting on June 28th. Now, if you want to be technical about it, I guess Mathewson was hitting .278 at the time. Of course, he had very few plate appearances since he was, a pitcher and all. Anyway, Mathewson's Sabre biography includes an absolutely ridiculous claim that Giants manager Horace Fogel was so impressed by his hitting ability that he wanted to make a first baseman out of him. I want to note here that I haven't found a shred of contemporary evidence for this. I mean, this is yet another example of baseball historians making up stories to fill in the gaps. That's something that we've already seen a few times in this video alone. The New York Evening World, which I think had the best baseball coverage in the city at the time, noted what a surprise it was to have Mathewson playing first base, and it questioned why the team would turn its best pitcher into a fielder. It also reported that Mathewson was being trained to eventually play shortstop, which honestly is even more ludicrous. Joe Bean started off the season at short for the Giants and played at the position before being released on June 30th. Bean wound up going back to the minor leagues and never played in the majors again. In other words, there might be some credibility to the story of Mathewson being converted to a shortstop, but seriously, it doesn't make any sense. I just don't buy it. True to form, the Giants found a way to lose to the Phillies in 12 innings with Mathewson at first. Matty played at first base again on June 30th and received all sorts of praise from the New York Evening World this time around. This time, however, the 1,500 fans gathered at the old Polo Grounds watched helplessly as the Giants lost to Boston 8-0. And then, on July 1st, the name Wagner was announced at shortstop for the Giants. The local fans started to wonder if owner Andrew Friedman hadn't pulled off the deal of the century. This Wagner turned out to be Heine Wagner, a raw 21-year-old rookie who had potential. Wagner's Sabre biography claims that John McGraw picked him up for the Giants, which, as you know by now, is impossible. McGraw was still in Baltimore. Like I said, this is an irritation, and I keep running into these basic mistakes. Now, baseball history is fun, it's fun to research, it's fun to write, and I respect the work that's already been done. But seriously, you guys at Sabre, you need to start checking facts. The Giants lost this game as well, 8-3. Mathewson pitched the July 2nd game, and O'Hagan went back to first base. Note, by the way, that there were rumors that John McGraw would come up from Baltimore to give the Giants fans something to cheer about. This is further evidence of what should be obvious to historians, that McGraw was not with the Giants yet. By the July 4th doubleheader, the Mathewson first base experiment had been completely abandoned. McGraw did get one detail right, however. Dan McGann took over first base as soon as McGraw arrived, and it was O'Hagan who McGraw released, not Dunn. Okay, I think we've got that covered. It's kind of hard to know why all of this happened, other than that the Giants were clearly short of players, but that's what happens when you start releasing your good players for no reason. Anyway, if you go back to that July 1st game, you'll notice that O'Hagan was hitting fourth for the Giants, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, my grandmother could hit better than him. There still is a problem left, though. Why did Mathewson play in the outfield later in the season? Outfielder Jim Jones was thrown out of the game in Cincinnati on July 14th. Christy Mathewson replaced him in left field, hit a double, and nearly got another double, but all to no avail. The Giants lost that game 6-0. Note as well that McGraw was not with the team yet, which is what this New York Sun article states at the end. Jones, by the way, was the same man who gave up 22 runs in a single game for Louisville in 1897. He is the man responsible for the worst relief pitching performance in baseball history. Check out my earlier video for the story behind that one. On August 6th, Jones was so upset by an umpiring decision that he punched the umpire in the face. McGraw ran to grab his outfielder when he saw what was happening, but was too late. McGraw suspended Jones after that incident. Jim Jones never played in the major leagues again and was never able to live down his infamous 1897 relief pitching disaster. Okay, do you remember my video the other day about John McGraw and Ban Johnson? Well, this incident is further evidence that McGraw wasn't just some out-of-control violent person. In fact, if you read the history of baseball closely, you will notice that McGraw, time and time again, was trying to prevent his players from attacking the umpires, and when players did attack them, he would punish them harshly. Mathewson's remaining outfield appearances came later in the season. On August 15th, with McGraw away scouting players in person, Mathewson started a game in right field. The Giants had only 12 men on the active roster for that road trip, which is why Mathewson made that right field start. The Giants managed to beat the Cubs this time around. Now, when you replay these old seasons, if you're like me, you've got to keep these limited rosters in mind. There are some people, mostly on the OOTP forums, who talk about what the roster limits actually were in those days, if they even existed. The truth, though, is that the roster limit rules back in 1901 and 1902 were barely enforced at all. Honestly, there was really nothing to discourage teams from playing with whatever players they could get their hands on. We know that that's true because you had guys like Connie Mack who would give trial contracts to sandlot players, have them come out and play a game or two, and then would get rid of them if they weren't good enough. He did that for his whole 50 years in the American League. Now, it also wasn't unusual back in those days for teams to wind up with almost no active players, like way below the roster limit. This is especially true of National League teams in 1902. McGraw was away again on August 30th when the Giants were in Philadelphia, and once again Mathewson started in right field. As the New York Evening World notes, acting manager George Smith had to start either Mathewson or McGinnity in right field, and he chose Mathewson. Mathewson hit a single in the bottom of the ninth to win this game for the Giants. Then, for the second game of an October 3rd doubleheader, Mathewson had the last outfield start of his career. And, you guessed it, McGraw was out scouting this time as well. The Giants were swept in this doubleheader against Boston. Well, there you have it. Mathewson's start in the field came mostly because the Giants did not have enough players to cover those positions. And McGraw was technically correct. I mean, he wasn't present for any of those starts. It technically wasn't his responsibility. As a closing note, I really should point out that it wasn't just Mathewson. The Iron Man, Joe McGinnity, also had 5 appearances in the field for the Giants in 1902, as well as 2 starts for the Orioles, also under John McGraw. Well, you'll also remember from our last video that McGraw was trying to juggle a roster in Baltimore that was also too small. Anyway, I guess that's just how things were back in 1902.